So chapter 9 discusses preparing a speech, and I just want to go over a few key highlights from the chapter and point out some things that should be helpful to you as you're preparing for the speeches in this class and any presentations that you'll need to give in the future. So section 1.1 talks about selecting and narrowing a topic, and the first and most important thing you can do is to ask yourself who your audience is. If you don't consider your audience first, you're going to spend a lot of time preparing and crafting a speech that may not have the effect that you want it to have because you haven't geared it towards an audience. If I were giving a speech on neurosurgery, I wouldn't talk about that in the same way to a group of fifth graders as I would to a group of pre-med students. So it's really important that you consider your audience, and at different types of communication events, different types of presentations, you're going to have more information about your audience available or less information about your audience available. There are three types of audience analysis. The first is demographic analysis, which looks at demographic characteristics. There are some cases where that's very diverse. So if you think about our classroom, especially in online class, it's a very diverse population. So there's a variety of people at different age levels, at different that are different races, different income levels. All of those sorts of things are demographic information that you have. There may be situations where you speak where you know more about the demographic population. So if I were speaking to a group of juniors in high school versus a senior citizen home, those sorts of things. Psychographic analysis looks at the audience's disposition towards the speaker, the topic, and the occasion. So are they required to be there? Are they not required to be there? How do they feel about you as a speaker? Have you done your job to establish yourself as credible in previous situations? And then what do they feel about the reason that they're there? Situation analysis also looks at the situation around your giving the speech. So what are the general feelings about that? What kind of space do you have available? At any point, I would say it's very important for you to look at the space that you're going to be speaking in. And in this class where you're presenting online, you want to give strong consideration to what you choose to speak behind. So pick a space that has ample space for you to move around, incorporate gestures. You want to make sure that the space is available for you to use any visual aids that you need to use. And one of the things that I mentioned in the annotations for this chapter is that, I've had people give speeches in their living room because they use their television to show their PowerPoint. And I've had people give speeches outside because they wanted to show a piece of farm equipment as their visual aid. So just think about where you're going to speak and make sure there aren't any distractions. You don't want the TV on in the background or dogs barking and walking by or people interrupting you. So just give some consideration to what you're doing for your space. The other thing that this section talked about were the different types of general purposes, specific purposes, and the thesis statement. Remember, the general purpose is just based on the occasion. So it's either to inform, to persuade, or to entertain. For the purposes of this class, you're going to do a speech that's informative and persuasive. The specific purpose is what you want to accomplish at the end of your speech. So it ties your audience to the general purpose and your topic. And you can see some examples of that in this section of the textbook, and also in the annotations that I've provided. I've given you some examples of what that might look like as well. And then the thesis statement just summarizes the main point of the speech. And if you're doing an informative speech, you're going to explain the thesis. If you're doing a persuasive speech, you're going to defend the thesis. So you'll have an opportunity to do each one of those. Again, in the annotations of chapter 9, I've provided you some more examples of thesis statements there. So section 9.2 talks about researching and supporting your speech. Some key things you want to remember is that library resources, and that doesn't mean that you always have to physically go to the library. There are databases online and reference librarians that are very helpful. In the annotations of this section, I've provided you links to the Grayson library and the resources that are available to you, but they are more suitable for college level research than just Googling something in those instances. There are times where you want some general information and that Google can be helpful. Regardless of what type of supporting material you use, you do want to evaluate the credibility of your supporting materials. So are they credible? Is there a lack of bias? All of those things are important for you to consider. I would strongly encourage you to revisit this section as you're looking at supporting materials and ask yourself those questions as you evaluate the supporting materials for your speech. You want to prefer primary sources over secondary sources. Remember, primary sources are sources where people have firsthand experience or they've researched it directly. So any peer review sources are great. Anybody you can interview that has testimony about the topic, those are all great examples of primary sources. Secondary sources are reporting on other information. So if you look at encyclopedias, those sorts of things, that's all secondary research. And it's just not as valuable in this type of setting as primary sources. And then the last thing I want you to remember is use a variety of supporting materials in your speech. So don't rely all on statistics or completely on examples. People are persuaded and informed by different types of information. So some want strong examples that are going to help them understand the material. Others do want, very good statistics that show the quantity or the magnitude of the problem. So use a variety of supporting materials and don't just rely on one. Section 9.3 talks about organizing your speech. Some key takeaways here are that I'm going to provide you with an outline template that I want you to use for the informative and the persuasive speech, but you want to make sure that you're following these highlights and these important tips as you're organizing. It's easy to want to start with the introduction. Don't do that. You want to start with the body of the speech and fully develop that so that you have a very clear understanding of what the content is, so that when you write the introduction, it actually represents that. Remember that the main points of the speech need to be guided by your thesis. So before you do anything, you need to determine what your specific purpose statement is and the thesis of the speech itself. You do need to decide how you want to organize the speech. For the informative speech, you're going to have two options. One is to follow a chronological organizational pattern. The second is to follow a topical organizational pattern. And then for the persuasive speech, you'll also have two options between following the problem solution organization pattern and Monroe's motivated sequence. So as you get ready to work on those speeches, go back and review the information about those organizational patterns. You want to incorporate supporting materials into each main point of the speech. Your main points should be supported with examples, statistics, testimony, visual aids, all of those things. And remember, citing your sources is incredibly important. You have to cite your sources if you're direct quoting or if you're paraphrasing them. You need to cite them when you write your outline, but you also need to cite them verbally. So make sure that you're including your material here. And there's great information in Chapter 9 that I've annotated that shows some good tips for how to cite sources depending on the type of supporting material. You want to use signposts, which are transition statements, preview statements, and review statements that help connect the body of the speech to the introduction and the conclusion, and also that help you move through the body of the speech efficiently. It's going to be important that you speak those when you deliver the speech so that your audience has a good understanding of the organization. The last thing that this section does is talk about the things that the introduction and the conclusion should include. Regardless of the type of speech, regardless of your topic, every introduction should have an attention getter, should introduce you to the topic, should establish your credibility and relevance. So your credibility as a speaker, why should we listen to you on this? And then relevance is how does it relate to the audience and how do you relate to the audience? And then you preview your main points. Chapter 9 has great examples of what could be good attention getters, and I would encourage you to go back and review that. And then finally, the conclusion should summarize the topic, review the main points, and end on a strong note. You do not want to end the speech by saying, okay, I'm done now. You want to end in a way that is meaningful and provides closure for your audience. So review 9.3 if you need some help with the conclusion. And then finally, section 9.4 talks about outlining. You're going to create 2 outlines for this speech. One of the misconceptions and something that people struggle with a lot is that they think that they're going to write out word for word what they're going to say. You're never going to do that for the speech in this class. You're going to turn in a formal outline. This is what it will be graded as the written portion of your speech. It's a full sentence outline that helps you as you're preparing, and you're going to follow the outline template that I give you. So it'll include all of the components that we just talked about in organization. It'll include the introduction, the body, the conclusion, supporting materials, transition statements, and other signposts. Also, we'll have a reference page. The speaking outline is what you are going to use as notes when you're delivering the speech. And I strongly encourage you to put the speaking outline on note cards. It's easier to hold and gives you more freedom to gesture and those sorts of things. Remember, the speaking outline should not be word for word. It should include speaking cues, and it should have enough content to get you through the speech confidently, but not so much that you're attempting to read it. So that's an introduction to chapter 9 and preparing your speech. You'll notice in the next week as we start working on the informative speech that I'm going to give you an outline template that I want you to follow and very clear instructions of what needs to be included for the informative speech. But chapter 9 is a great resource to come back to as you're preparing speeches for the class and in the future. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know.